I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming, particularly for being bold enough to attend so near to the site of a well-known disaster. So many of our politicians, including the mayor and two of the city councilors who represent a big chunk of the street we're talking about, Francis Nunziata and Cesar Palacio, have sung the tragic hymn of the wreck of the streetcar St. Clair so often and so vividly that it's heartening to see the survivors huddling together like this for strength to pick up the pieces. Of course, if you're here for a talk like this, at a symposium like this, in a place like this, you already know well that anyone visiting St. Clair West today will find it far from disastrous. Instead, it offers much to celebrate, plenty that fascinates, and it has a lot to teach us about the city we live in, about where we came from, how we became the kind of place we are, how we should continue to grow. As I've prepared for this talk, turning my thinking to this often unsung Toronto High Street, not as prominent in the imagination of the city as your Queen Street Wests or your Yonge Streets or your 401s, I've been amazed at the many ways it reflects the evolution of Toronto's history and demonstrates some of the most important principles of great neighborhood and city building, of community building, the very same principles that made Toronto the great city that it is, as I discuss in my book, Some Great Idea, Good Neighborhoods, Crazy Politics, and the Invention of Toronto, which you can find for sale at a table just over them. These are lessons we need to have in mind right now, during a municipal election year, at the conclusion of 4 years or more, 2 decades more or less, of contentious and often outright insane city politics. I think St. Clair West offers a handy frame to consider some of those things, and I want to thank the organizers of this symposium, particularly Jay Young and Daniel Ross, who I've been speaking to alongside their colleagues at York University and the other universities that were mentioned in the introduction, and the people here at the Barns, for giving me the opportunity to consider this place and these things and to share some of my reflections with you today. You can feel free to applaud the organizers of this now. Sometimes when you go to a speech, they ask you to hold your applause till the end, but I would encourage you, if you hear something you agree with or you feel deserves cheering, you just go ahead and let it out. Don't bottle that stuff up. Yeah. It's not healthy to bottle it up. Express it. However, I would ask you to save your booing till the end. Like, if you disagree and you want to express that, save it for the part of the evening's events that takes place in your home, much later tonight. In the privacy of your living room, you can be like, boo, you took a shot at Cesar Palacio right in the introduction. You're hawking your book. And that way, that's a healthy way to express that, I think. Alternately, you can express your thoughts in the form of a question a little later on when Sean joins me on stage here, you know, if that's the kind of thing you prefer. The asking you to save your booing, your derision until the end is sort of a defense mechanism because, as is so often the case for me, I suspect that tonight I'm going to be talking about many things that some of you know more about than me. History, urban planning, life and work on St. Clair West. I'm not an expert on these things. I have virtually no formal training in them. I'm an observer who's looked at them attentively, if unsystematically, for the past 10 years or so. And I've been lucky enough to make a job out of doing that, so I'm happy to share those reflections with you tonight. I was reminded recently that George Orwell wrote that sometimes things get to the point that the first duty of intelligent men is to restate the obvious. So without inflating my own intelligence, I'll attempt to do that tonight, do a bit of restating the obvious. I am personally in debt to our wise civic ancestors who decided to put a streetcar on St. Clair. I live at the west end of the streetcar line in the Stockyards area of the junction near St. Clair and Keele. Almost every day, I choose to ride the streetcar. From my home, it's actually a little faster for me to travel to work by a different route, getting on the Keele bus, going down to the subway station, transferring again at St. George. If I'm in a rush, I can save 10 minutes by going that way. But the streetcar in St. Clair is just so much better. I get on at the first stop out of Guns Loop, and I get to ride through neighborhoods to see people and places, to be in the city as I travel. There's a cornball streetcar driver who's often on the St. Clair West route who always calls out, "Toasted Western" at Old Weston Road for no reason I can determine, except to liven things up. And it makes it a more interesting ride. In so many ways, the streetcar is just a more interesting ride than the Kiel bus or the subway. It's also, I get a seat where I get on, and I save a transfer, so there's that too. But I feel as though streetcars are the iconic Toronto method of transportation. I grew up with a bedroom overlooking Gerrard Street East, with streetcars rolling past every so often, night and day, full of hundreds of people. Railway lines that connect neighborhoods just as our great national railways connect the provinces and cities of this country. Streetcars rattle as they pass, but they're smooth when you're riding on them, and an awesome way to move through the city, not just to move through the city, but to see it as you do it. From the slightly elevated perch, peering in shop windows and restaurant patios, you can note places to hop off when there's time to linger. And of course, you get to visit some parts of the line when your car gets short-turned. Hello, Earl's Court, my old friend. In the 1970s, there was a plan to scrap streetcars in Toronto, but a committed group of residents fought to save them. And now many cities across North America are building or rebuilding their own streetcar lines. They're not without controversy, but we'll get to that later. In any event, streetcars are built into my conception of what Toronto is. And of course, they're built into what St. Clair Avenue is too. That's the case for so many essential Toronto things. You find them exemplified on St. Clair. Just this week, I walked the length of the St. Clair streetcar line, from Yonge Street in the east to Guns Loop in the west. It's a good walk, a long one, makes you appreciate the streetcar option that's there. But there's so much to see in the neighborhoods of this street that was once a scattering of small towns on the outskirts of Toronto. Deer Park, Forest Hill, Brackendale Village, that's where we are now, Carlton Village, West Toronto Junction. Then they became suburbs, then uptown, then midtown, and finally, in the lexicon of our current political debates, downtown. There's so much Toronto history and the evolution of the city that you can read on the street there. There's the longtime home of the St. Mike's Majors hockey team near Bathurst Street, which was for generations part of the farm system of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the place where the world came to know Ted Lindsay, Frank Mahovlich, Tim Horton, Jerry Cheevers, Dave Keon, Red Kelly. These are important people to me. There, Father David Bauer recognized in such a Canadian statement hockey as both an expression of God's glory and a builder of character, and from there he founded the first National Olympic hockey program. The Majors were affiliated with St. Michael's College, still are, I think, of course, just one of the private institutions on St. Clair or within a few blocks of it where the city's establishment has been educated. There's Upper Canada College, which has graduated 3 premiers, 4 mayors of Toronto, 7 chief justices, and 6 lieutenant governors. There's another old boy from a UCC trying to become mayor now, make it 5. De La Salle College, where I attended for a year, just a year. The Bishop Strawn School. Over at Oakwood is the public high school that gave us politician Stephen Lewis, journalist Patrick Watson, R&B singer Julie Black, and Bob Ezrin, who produced Pink Floyd's The Wall album with its iconic single that told us we don't need no education, which I don't know if that's a reflection of the educational institutions of St. Clair or not. But wandering along St. Clair West, you encounter a park named for Glenn Gould, near where he once lived, a church named for Timothy Eaton, where World War I flying ace Billy Bishop was married. You can see the tip of Casa Loma, the ridiculous and beautiful mansion that was Henry Palat's monument and his downfall after he brought hydroelectricity to Toronto. Ironically, I read it was the energy bills that finally bankrupted him. You pass just north of Wychwood Park, the once gated artist community that was home to Marmaduke Matthews and Marshall McLuhan. In the East End at Yonge is the just-closed CFRB studio, where Wally Crowder was the voice of Toronto mornings, just north of the 1050 Chum building, where Toronto met the Beatles and rock and roll, and the CBC studio, where Mr. Dressup rummaged around in his tickle trunk. At the western end, you see Hayden House, once a railway hotel, the site of a famous brawl that led to alcohol sales being prohibited in the Junction, a prohibition that lasted until 2000. And in the very west end, there's the stockyards, once the province's largest livestock market, home to the Toronto's meatpacking industry, an essential element of Hogtown. I could go on, but what I'm saying is that these are people that you encounter on St. Clair West who did things, places where things happened, where the city was built. Its culture, literature, sports, industry, and politics, their names and legacy are inscribed on the street. Their giant footprints are there for us to walk in. But what I'm not saying is that it's a museum preserved for commemoration. It's anything but that. In the tradition of Toronto, the streets show evolution, sometimes really messy. Sometimes you wouldn't call it beautiful to look at it. It's hodgepodge rather than carefully planned. I discuss in my book why I think that quality is important in all the places you see in Toronto that work really well. I tried to look at the identity of this city that sometimes seems to have so little definition to its identity. And in the city's history, I focused on three qualities that I think have made Toronto what it is, that have built its successes in the places it's been successful. And I think you can see all of these three qualities in action on St. Clair West. The first is diversity. It's there in the city's motto, we all know. Diversity, our strength. And it's there on St. Clair Avenue. I happened to be walking along the street in the middle of the World Cup. You could see lineups outside the bars in the middle of the day of flag-waving supporters of Mexico. The next day on the streetcar, I encountered more flag-waving supporters, this time of Chile. Today, you would have seen them from Italy and Portugal. In the various neighborhoods of St. Clair West, you find the institutions of the traditional Protestant and Catholic establishment of Toronto, as I mentioned. But you also find the historical markers of the oldest Jewish social club in the city, the monument to Italian immigrants, with its cry and letters set in stone in two languages, I speak peace, peace, peace. You find Albert's Real Jamaican Foods and Dutch Dreams Ice Cream Shop at Vaughan, just moved a little bit down the street there recently. You find people from across Latin America and the Caribbean, significant numbers of Filipinos, and a growing number of halal food stores. You can notice some of the ethnic group tribalism that has sometimes defined Toronto neighborhoods, but across the breadth of the street, you see a mixture of voices from around the world together like in a chorus that you can hear on the street. But of course, diversity, as it's defined in our motto, is not just about multiculturalism, not when we talk about how cities are built, how neighborhoods work. Toronto's strength and St. Clair's comes from so many more forms of it. Along the breadth of this streetcar line, you see people from across the economic spectrum. And you see, looking closely at the street, a mixture of types of places, too. Different uses and building types and heights. There are blocks of traditional Toronto single-family homes, detached and semi-detached townhouses running up and down the side streets in blocks around St. Clair. There are residential apartment towers, mid-rises and high-rises that defined apartment living in Toronto well before the current condo boom. In fact, there's a building on St. Clair near Walmer Road, on Walmer Road, it's a high-rise rental apartment tower that's celebrating this weekend 50 years on the street. It was preceded by Deco and modernist towers, at least a generation older than that, and it will be followed by new condos whose presentation centers are only just now opened. People shop and work and go to school in the neighborhoods along St. Clair, too, as they always have. The storefronts and restaurants and bars are the most noticeable part of it for a visitor, mostly in the small form that we've come to understand as making a great place walkable, because it offers variety and visual interest. But there's also, especially out at the West End in the old stockyard, some experiments in urbanizing big box stores and reinventing the old model of a mall. We'll see how successful those are after a while, alongside new townhouses there. But also, they exist alongside remaining industrial uses. There are manufacturers, a rail-to-truck warehouse complex, meat processing plants, car repair shops. People still work there along the rail lines, making things in Toronto. And people work in almost all the neighborhoods along St. Clair West. There are government and institutional buildings, other kinds of white-collar employers, and again, in the varied architectural styles of the time they were built. One of them, a modernist concrete insurance tower, was a draft design for Toronto City Hall that Nathan Phillips rejected. This diversity of the types of buildings and the uses of buildings, it's important, though it's easy enough to overlook. And it's something the builders of newer suburbs did overlook. Something I sometimes fear some of those building new condo communities in Toronto still overlook. That the diversity of uses and building types are a big part of what makes a neighborhood thrive, especially because almost all of it meets the street at a walkable scale. People can work and eat and live and celebrate World Cup victories or otherwise in the same street, meet each other on foot as they do. The second important principle that I identify in my book is democracy, which I take to mean a sense of community and active citizenship, of the inclusion of people in the processes. Once again, you see that on St. Clair, in the community gardens out on Old Weston Road, in the web of business improvement areas that bring a form of local government to neighborhood commercial communities, in the many proud residents associations in all the historic communities along the street. There's a landmark of sorts, of significance to all of Toronto that really captures the spirit of local democracy here. It's a well-told story because it's a landmark noteworthy for what's not there. At Spadina today, there's a park, among other things, but there's not a highway. In the mania for road travel that gripped North America in the 1950s and 1960s, a highway network snaking through the city was planned and partly built. The Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner Expressway came first. Next up was the Spadina Expressway. It was built as far south as Lawrence and was to have continued down through Forest Hill, across St. Clair, of course, through the Annex and beyond. I don't think I need to remind this audience necessarily of how a group of residents from St. Clair and from the Annex and the other communities affected by it, led by Jane Jacobs and John Sewell and Colin Vaughan, including Marshall McLuhan and plenty of other university professors, led a successful movement to stop the highway. They had to fight the municipal government of the time, the city government, the metro government. They finally found an ally in the provincial premier, Bill Davis, who said when he canceled it famously, if we were building a city for cars, this would be a good place to start. If we're building a city for people, this is a good place to stop. There were echoes of that fight and the sentiments expressed in it on both sides of the debate around the St. Clair streetcar right-of-way. Maybe we'll come back to that in a little bit, but as long as we're talking about the corner of St. Clair and Spadina, I want to point out another significant landmark there, Winston Churchill Park and the St. Clair Reservoir. In my book, I talk about the other key, I think, to Toronto's success, which is infrastructure and the necessity to build it properly. I focus a lot in this book on the story of R.C. Harris, the powerful works commissioner in the early 20th century and the post-war period, who built much of Toronto as we now know it, the sidewalks, the bridges that we still use today. When he came to office, the city had a disastrously bad water quality problem. The rate of death for children from bacterial infections and other waterborne illnesses was sky high, an international disgrace. He embarked on updating it, building the sewage system that we're partly just now updating 100 years later. And famously, he built the palace of water filtration that bears his name out in the beaches. Part of his vision included expanding infrastructure to serve not just the crisis of the city as it was then, not just the crisis the city then faced, which was really focused in the then downtown area, especially the slums of the ward, which cover the area where now City Hall now sits, but also the needs of the city as it would become. It was that motivated him to want to build things out into what were then the suburbs, the far reaches of Toronto, including a plan to install a giant water tower in the then suburban area of St. Clair. He was supported in that ambition by local Forest Hill residents, but opposed by penny-pinching bureaucrats and politicians who objected to the $130,000 price tag that it carried with it. The water tower never got built, but in the late 1920s, the reservoir was constructed with its magnificent stone entrances embedded under the park that now exists and still serves as a local gathering place today. R.C. Harris's fingerprints, like there at St. Clair and Spadina, are all over the city. In the sidewalk and bridge network he built, the water infrastructure we still use today, the streetcar network that he amalgamated and expanded as the predecessor to today's TTC. It's something we sometimes seem to have forgotten. We're still fighting, as he did when he wanted to build the St. Clair water tower, and famously when he wanted to build the Bloor Viaduct and include a subway corridor underneath it generations before we'd ever have a subway. We still find, as he did, the people who say the infrastructure we need or will need is too extravagant to spend money on. So diversity, democracy, infrastructure, these are the things that we built Toronto by fostering and encouraging, and these are the things that you find in the history of St. Clair West. Now, let's talk about the streetcar right-of-way. It's an example of infrastructure building in recent memory, and you may have heard that it's not uncontroversial. In fact, it featured prominently in two different election campaigns. In 2006, when it was about to be constructed, when David Miller planted visions of it as a sort of above-ground subway, a model of the LRT building we were then talking about planning on embarking on, and again in 2010, when it was recently opened after a drawn-out, painful, and radically over-budget building process, when Rob Ford held it up as a disaster. It's neither of those things, of course. What it is, I think, in my experience, is a very good streetcar line that suffered from some planning and execution problems, both in its construction and sometimes in its operation today. The street, as you can tell just by walking down it, seems to be thriving alongside the streetcar. Ridership was up in 2012 by more than 15% over the pre-construction period. Collisions are down. Car traffic, despite some hiccups, seem to move along just fine. Real estate prices and condo construction seem to indicate a neighborhood that people love all the more, right? Or a series of neighborhoods, actually, all the way along it, that people love all the more. Some of them are still struggling, especially out near Old Weston Road, but they were struggling before, and will come maybe a bit to struggles as we move along. We can learn from the hiccups that we see both in its operation and in its construction. It's still a mystery why the different agencies responsible for building it and the infrastructure that went with it couldn't coordinate their various work to keep from having to reopen the street multiple times and driving up the budget. It's still a mystery to me why the bridge near Old Weston Road was not widened to avoid the bottlenecks that have become a routine feature of that segment of the street, where all east-west traffic for a whole segment of the city is choked into one lane in each direction. It's a mystery to me, and an ongoing frustration, that it was sold to the public as a sort of an LRT in action, when it's actually an old-fashioned streetcar right-of-way like we have on Spadina. And I think the decision to allow so much parking on the street instead of, say, opening more green pea lots on side streets nearby was a mistake. We're still sorting out the left turns, how to make them work best, but I think overall it works. And I think and hope we can learn from the planning and construction errors as we embark on new projects. I think we can also learn that building infrastructure, transit infrastructure, or any other kind is not painless. It's long and hard and messy, and all of these projects go over budget. All of these projects seem to take forever, and that actually causes real pain. As the merchants on St. Clair learned, as the merchants on Eglinton are now learning, when you are investing in your future, when you're building infrastructure that will pay off in the long term, there are short-term problems, but we have to deal with those problems if we're going to get to the place we want to be. I hope St. Clair, my observation of St. Clair West is that in the longer term, it demonstrates itself how worth it is. There were many people who predicted disaster, and an organized group of residents, not crazy people, but genuinely concerned and motivated local business owners and residents, fought its construction. Many of them still point to the shortcomings they see in it. Councillor Joe Mihevik, who's here tonight, I think, had to fight at least one election against the leaders of the groups that opposed it. He won those elections. But respectfully to those people who opposed it and continue to oppose it, I disagree, but I thank them for their voices in debate because I think it helped make the process better than it could have been. It helped to some extent, maybe, to improve the design. But it's heartening to me to see that the process includes places for genuine debate. And I think we can learn from conflict because, again, as I discuss in my book, I think that diversity and democracy, whether you're talking about building infrastructure or anything else, come with conflict built right into them. It's conflict is the way that we learn about each other's needs, and it's the way we refine ideas. It's often painful and ugly, and in the past of this city, our conflict has involved like attempted armed rebellions. But as the debate about St. Clair and transit in general in this city shows, it's also often very, very frustrating to participate in. One man's disaster is another woman's success, and it can be hard often to even realize that they're talking about the same stretch of road or the same city, but we need them both. We need all of them, all of us, in the conversation. That's something that we've encountered a lot, I think, in the last 4 years here as our politics has seemed to be more divisive. Conflict in which the participants in a debate don't even seem to be talking about the same thing. They don't acknowledge the same set of facts. But I think to look on the bright side, we're having a pretty vigorous, heated debate about, say, public transit, about infrastructure, about condo construction in this city, and it's one that we really need to have. But to sum up a part of this, I think it's no mystery why St. Clair West is a series of relatively thriving communities. The building blocks of vitality have always been here. It's a mixed-use, mixed-income, mixed-building type, multicultural community with great transportation and social infrastructure, with involved active residents, diversity, democracy, infrastructure. These things are built right into St. Clair as it exists. There's maybe a great example of how these things come together as the community evolves right here in this building, in the Artscape Witchwood Barns. A great historic piece of infrastructure, a streetcar barn built just over 100 years ago to serve what was then the suburbs and small towns. But as Toronto and its streetcar housing needs have changed, it has become as Jane Jacobs said, an old building that's home to a new idea. Artscape, in partnership with the city, and I think with some funding from the federal government, has transformed it into a new kind of community cultural center. Food, music, the arts, nonprofit community groups, even wonky symposia make use of it as a civic resource, a place for citizens to come together as they create the next version of this neighborhood and of this city. I'm not sure, but I imagine maybe many of you were hoping or expecting from me more talk of the current situation at City Hall, and maybe we can cover some of that in the Q&A. But I can't pretend that the city can learn everything it needs to know about dealing with its current problems by looking here at the Witchwood Barns or at St. Clair West. We confront a political scene that, even before it became dominated by the character flaws of one man, was facing real challenges. Divisions, exaggerated but real, between suburb and city, travelers on bikes and transit and in cars, increasingly between the rich and the poor, and ethnic groups who, though we're more diverse than we ever have been, seem to be sorting into distinctly different areas of the city away from each other. We're suffering because parts of this city did not evolve as St. Clair West did, as a streetcar suburb at human scale, but were built to alienating scale in a few decades of misguided planning. We're wrestling with a generation or more of neglect for this city's infrastructure. We can't erase it all and build anew, and we shouldn't even if we could. But I think as we face how to resolve these conflicts and talk about how to move forward in this monumental election and beyond, we do well to keep in mind these lessons that I've outlined that worked for us here, the way this place and other famously successful neighborhoods of the city have grown and built on their histories and evolved through diversity, democracy, and good infrastructure, built and adapted and rebuilt through messy, contentious conflicts and through bold new ideas that respect history and community. We'll need that kind of process, those kind of ideas, as we begin talking about how to expand good infrastructure out into Scarborough, into North Etobicoke. I should say, as we continue talking about how to expand good infrastructure, transit and otherwise, out into Scarborough, into Etobicoke, into parts of North York, as we confront a rhetoric that talks about things like the war on the car, and that views every investment in the city in good planning as some kind of plot against suburban residents and a tax and spend scheme to impoverish Rob Ford and his friends and supporters. And as we look at the concrete towers in a park that line the major streets of our suburban areas in Toronto, as we look at the oceans of parking lot that line those major streets, and we try to think about how adaptive reuse applies to those, we will need, I was going to say the kind of creativity that went into this place and other places, but it may be more creativity than that, more ideas and more of the sort of vision that builds a city for the future and for the needs of the people who live in the neighborhoods, so that all the neighborhoods in this city can enjoy the kind of active, vibrant life that you find here on St. Clair West. That's how we built this city, and that's how, if we're going to be successful, we're going to build the city that we will become. That's it for my prepared notes. So I will invite Sean to come back here on stage, and we'll chat for a few minutes, and then we are happy to take your questions.